Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Sarah Berger. I'm the co-chair of the Mass Incarceration Task Force. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the task force and also on behalf of the New York City Bar Association and on behalf of our president, Sheila Boston, who has made criminal justice reform one of her top priorities. As we all know, this is a really important moment right now for criminal justice reform. And when we were planning this event, we were really excited. We saw a very exciting moment for bringing reform to New York. Now we're seeing, even in one of the most progressive areas in the country, we're seeing some roadblocks put up based on this tension that arises out of public safety concerns and reform. So we hope our panelists will discuss tonight whether that supposed tension can be reconciled and whether and how New York can move forward to end this era of mass incarceration. How can we bring about change? How can we overcome these roadblocks? We're so honored, we're so excited to have the panelists that we have tonight. DA Bragg, who is a longtime member of the Bar Association. We are so grateful to have you here tonight to join us. We congratulate you on your historic election. Senator Myrie, who I'm proud to say is my senator, we are very happy to have you as well, and we're eager to hear from you how the legislature is going to address these issues. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Professor Pfaff, is running a little late, so when he comes, we will introduce him, but he is a very important voice in this discussion. He brings a lot of an innovative approach to how he looks at the data, and so we'll be very, looking forward to hearing from him. And finally, we have Julian Harris-Calvin, who I am very fortunate to have as my co-chair on the task force. And in her day job, she is at the Vera as the director of the Greater Justice Project. So Greater Justice Project. So she is going to bring her incredible knowledge and policy background to this discussion, and we're very fortunate to have her. I don't want to take away any time from this discussion, so I'm going to introduce our moderator, Tess Cohen. She also has an interesting perspective on these issues, as she is a former prosecutor with the Manhattan DA's office, and she is now a criminal defense lawyer. She was the driving force behind the task force report that we issued last year, A Pathway Out of Mass Incarceration and Toward a New Criminal Justice System, which is available on our website. And she's a member of the task force and also the chair of the Criminal Justice Operation Committee here at the Bar Association. So I'll turn it over to Tess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our attendees as well. We can't see you, but we're very grateful that you're here. I'm going to give just brief backgrounds on our panelists before we move into the questions. First, DA Bragg, who was elected to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office this November and is the first Black Manhattan DA in the history of the office. A son of Central Harlem, Alvin has spent the better part of 2 decades standing up to the powerful and fighting to get justice. He was a prosecutor in the Attorney General's office as the Chief Deputy Attorney General, as well as an Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He is an experienced prosecutor who firmly believes that safety and justice must go hand in hand, and that ameliorating deep inequities in the justice system will make Manhattan safer. Next, we have Senator Zellnor Myrie, who represents the 20th District, which includes several neighborhoods in central Brooklyn that have been at the epicenter of both the gun violence crisis, as well as community-driven solutions to address it. Currently serving in his 2nd term, he is the author of New York's groundbreaking gun industry liability law, the first state law in the country to hold manufacturers and dealers accountable for their irresponsible actions in the marketplace. I think I'll hold off on Professor Pfaff's bio. Maybe I'll intro him when he shows up real quick. And then we have Julian Harris-Calvin, who is the program director, as Sarah mentioned, for the Greater Justice New York program at Vera Institute for Justice, where she advocates for and examines a lot of the, there he is. She analyzes the data and advocates for a lot of the reforms that are happening right here on the ground in New York. She's also a former public defender. She was a public defender in both Washington, D.C., as well as with the federal defenders here in New York. And then Professor John Pfaff, who's just joined us, is a professor of law at Fordham University. His research focuses on empirical matters related to criminal justice. He is also the author of Locked In: The True Causes of Mass Incarceration and How to Achieve Real Reform. We have a lot to cover today, so I think we'll get right into the questions from here. And as a way of sort of introducing the audience to our panelists, I'd love to ask each of you, I think it's fair to say we all care deeply about ending the era of mass incarceration. And I'd love to know how each of the panelists came to this work and came to make it an important part of their life to end this era of mass incarceration. And Senator Myrie, would you be willing to start us off on that topic?
Happy to. And let me thank the Bar Association and, of course, my esteemed panelists for having this conversation tonight. I remember getting the invitation to it, being incredibly excited to speak on it. And of course, we are in a moment of public discourse where we're not, I don't think, operating from the same set of facts in having this conversation. And I'm excited to be with folks that will base this conversation in the realities that we're facing. I was born and raised in the district that I have the honor of representing now. And so I'm a Brooklyn boy through and through. And growing up, I grew up mostly in Flatbush. I went to school in Crown Heights. The presence of law enforcement was always omnipresent. I was born in the late 80s. And so my formative years were under the Giuliani years, where that was the approach to law enforcement. So mass incarceration, the presence of law enforcement seemed very normal to me growing up. I think I had a realization when I was in law school. I had the opportunity to teach at Auburn Correctional Facility, which is a maximum prison upstate. And I remember my first day in class, we were talking to the students, and almost 75% of the class was from Brooklyn. I remember going at the end of the class, we were told the training for the program, they tell the law students, they give you sort of parameters on how you should be interacting. And they said, don't give too many details about yourself, et cetera. At the end of my first class, one of the students asked me, are you from Brooklyn? And I said, yeah, how did you know? And he said, well, I could tell by the way that you tied your Timbs. For those of us who are familiar with that. And it was such a seemingly innocuous moment, but one in which I connected very deeply to how much mass incarceration affected where I grew up and where I get to represent now. And I think since that moment on, I've been engaging in how I could best utilize my talents to help dismantle what I believe is an addiction to mass incarceration here in the state of New York. And I've had the honor to be able to put some of that into policy in the state Senate.
Thank you. DA Bragg, could you give a follow up and let us know?
Sure. So, Harlem and Brooklyn share some commonalities. I guess these are bad commonalities to share, but experiences similar to those of the senator engaging early. So before I was 21, I had kind of 6 gun incidents, 3 with the police, pointing guns at me, and 3 arising from more traditional public safety issues. Homicide victim on my doorstep, a semi-automatic weapon to my head, a knife to my throat. And so I went off to college and law school, really, trying to kind of put the puzzle pieces together of, here I am on the one hand, being stopped at great force by those, entrusted to keep me safe. And then on the other hand, was not actually safe. And so that's what caused me to really go into a career in the law. And then ultimately, after some time in private practice, going into more than 15 years in government, where I've really worked at the intersection, both working on issues like NYPD stop and frisk policy, and the report by the Attorney General's office showing that only 0.1% of the stops for a 4-year period resulted in a conviction for a gun offense, which of course was the initial thesis, but also doing more traditional work like the actual armed robbery cases and things of that nature. So that's what led me to the work, and those many of those conditions still exist. And I joke about kind of Harlem and Brooklyn, but the tie that binds is that if you close your eyes, I don't know if we tie our Timberlands the exact same way. I don't know how you tie them in Brooklyn, but if you close your eyes, many of the same conditions are the same, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you. Ms. Harris-Calvin, could you tell us how you came to this work?
Sure, I'm feeling a little out of place because I am a Los Angelino, but I live in Flatbush and my mother's from Harlem, so I feel a connection. I actually got started in this work the summer before law school. I went to law school in LA, where I'm from, and I thought I was going to go into education policy, but that summer before I started, I was on a death penalty jury, which I would never be selected for post law school, but I was on that jury and happened to be in the same courtroom as Tess when she was a first year law student. She was an intern with the prosecution on that case. So it's a very small world. But the experience of being on a death penalty jury, particularly for the sentencing phase in Los Angeles County of all places, where we had a true cross-section of the community, people from all backgrounds, most of the demographic categories one could get with 12 folks. And being part of that process and seeing what essentially was, I think Tess will agree, a circus with a man's life on the line happening before me really made me want to get into death penalty work. So my first summer in law school, I went to the South and did some death penalty work and found that maybe I would like to do some other kind of defense work that wasn't as heavy with such high stakes. And so that's why I became a public defender after spending my second summer in law school at the public defender's office in DC and at the federal defender. And so that's how I got to this work. Obviously, as you can all see, I'm Black and I am someone with cousins and uncles and 2 Black fathers. And so, it is hard to not hear the stories of the experiences of Black men and Black women, predominantly Black men, in terms of how the criminal justice system and policing affects them. And so I also have that lens through which I look at the work. And so that's how I got into the job, Tess.
And what Julian is leaving out of that story is she was the lone holdout in 11-1 on the death penalty phase for death. And so, earned my gratitude for life after watching that particular circus, if you will. And saved a man's life. So finally, Professor Pfaff, could you tell us how you came to this work?
Sure. And first, my apologies for popping up late. I had an in-person event at Lincoln Center, then to get my kids in person from school. It was so much in person that I'm actually now rusty getting across the city in person. I mistimed it. I apologize for that. So I came with this from a completely different direction than everyone else. As you can guess, as a middle-class white kid, I had no interaction with the police at all. I mean, I might have talked to them because they're the friendly guy down the street I was told to run to if I was in trouble, right? But I had no negative experiences with the police at all growing up in any meaningful sense. And, I grew up in Buffalo, and even though my school was integrated, my friends were not. And so even my friends' circle didn't really experience anything either. And so I got to grad school in economics, and I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to write about. Prisons and policing seemed kind of interesting. I was at the same school as Steve Levitt, who wrote for economics. And so that was sort of in the air. I started reading these papers on prisons, and it was purely a statistical exercise for me, right? Like, these are these papers, they were all statistically terrible. It was a really cool question to start as a grad student to start tackling. And so I did. But as I think one of 2 things happens if you're sort of a stats person in this world. Either you become incredibly sort of closed off to it and you stick very statistical and you really sort of shut the humanity of it out to sort of stay focused on the stats side of it entirely, or the human cost of it all starts coming in and you can't turn away from that. And I think I fall more into that second camp, right? I try to be very respectful for where the numbers are going and not go where they don't go and misstate what they state, but also as the fact that, this is not an issue on which one can just be neutral in any capacity, right? Any paper you write on this, anything you say, any way you choose to frame it, it's all has huge, deeply political and moral and humanitarian implications that we have to be honest with and wrestle with. And so it was for me sort of a gradual evolution from sort of a sterile econometric problem to solve to really realizing that it was about something much more profound and deep that demanded a much more powerful response.
Thank you to everyone. And actually, Professor Pfaff, I'd love to stay with you. And you sort of talked about some of those statistics. Like when we talk about the era of mass incarceration, like from an empirical standpoint, what are we talking about? What does that mean?
Yeah, so there's this period. It starts around 1972. It kind of ends briefly in 2000, then continues on 2010, where state prison and the feds, but the states where I focus on, prison populations just grew. And we talk about sort of this explosion in incarceration. I think that actually misstates it. What's really shocking, if you look at this graph, is the line is drawn with like a ruler. It's almost a perfectly straight line from about 1973 to about 2000. Presidents come and go, recessions, economic booms, the crime rate goes up, the crime rate goes down. And it's just a slow, unrelenting march. And, in the early 1970s, we had an incarceration rate slightly higher than the European average, right? Europe and Canada around 100,000. We were like 120. Not that weird. In fact, it was so stable that one very prominent criminologist wrote a paper published in 1979 saying it would never rise above about 100,000. We'll always keep it there. There's forces that keep it in balance. We didn't, right? It just soared. And by the time we hit 2000, our rate was 6 or 7 times that of most European countries. We had the highest rate in the world. We still have the highest rate in the world. In 2000, it kind of wobbles a little bit and it sort of flattens and it grows a little bit more slowly. And then in 2010 is the first time you see a decline. Even then, it's not much of a decline, and about half the drop was just the state of California. So what we saw is California had a huge change. Other states kind of trailed behind. When do we go from low to medium to mass? I don't know where those cutoff points are, right? But we've hit this point now where incarceration is so vast, it actually changes social institutions, right? So there's a paper arguing the fact that in heavily incarcerated communities, it actually changes relationship formation because, usually you don't have one man to one woman, and it throws off dating because everything's out of whack, or it caused our unemployment statistics to turn around. Bill Clinton claimed the single biggest accomplishment of his administration, one of them was he said it was the first time ever that Black men without a high school degree saw their unemployment rate drop. But it didn't. If you're in prison, we don't count you as unemployed. You're out of the equation altogether. And we locked up so many Black men during the 90s that it actually caused the line to go down, when if you take into account their pre-incarceration employment, it should have gone up, right? And so we've hit this point now where we have so many people in prison that's warping national statistics. It's causing, it's undermining entire neighborhood functions. It actually drives politics. In lots of states, prisoners count as living in the prison in which they are housed, not the community they came from. And you have all these prisons in rural areas that are fairly Republican, full of people from Democratic cities who can't vote. And there are state reps all across the country, not New York, that doesn't count it this way anymore, but there are state reps all across the country who their seats depend upon having those bodies in their prisons. It is, and I do not use this, I use this very intentionally, is a 5/5 compromise, right? They cause a full person with no voting power. We've hit that point where it's changing your politics, it's changing your statistics, it's changing entire neighborhood formation. That's mass, and that's where we are. And the decline we've seen over the past, 11 years, we've gone from super mass to really, really mass, right? We're still very much in that mass category, and not changing rapidly. At the rate we're declining, it's a good 70 more years to get back to where we were in the 70s. It's been a meaningful but slow decline. And so I think that's what mass to me means. It's like when it starts having fundamental changes to how systems operate, that's when it's in that mass category.
And Julian, could you just give us a little bit of a picture of what it looks like in New York specifically?
Sure, just to piggyback on what Professor Pfaff said and focus specifically on numbers in New York, he's right that we've gone from extremely mass to mass here in New York State, which is something. It's not the end of the road, but it is something. And I think some numbers really help to illustrate what that looks like. So, after we in New York dismantled the notorious Rockefeller drug laws, and raising the age of criminal responsibility, we saw New York's prison population fall from more than 73,000 folks incarcerated in prisons on any given day in 1999 to fewer than 44,000 in February of 2020. So that's a huge decline, but 44,000 people in prison is still a lot. And then it continued to decline, particularly after COVID. And so we have about 30,000 folks in New York prisons. And, our state leaders have done a good job of starting to close some prisons too. So we are making progress, and Professor, please correct me if I'm wrong on any of these numbers, but we are making progress. But part of the problem that we're seeing crystallize, even with this decline in prison populations, is that our prison population is getting older. In New York, in 2008, about 12% of the state's prison population were folks who were age 50 and older, and 50 is not old unless you're in prison. The conditions in prison really cause people to age and have a much lower life expectancy. So 50 is elderly for folks who are in prison for long term. And so there are about 12% of folks in 2008. Since then, that share of the population has increased to about a quarter of the folks, so 30,000 people who are incarcerated in New York now, are 50 and older. And those are folks who've been there mostly, many of them, since the 90s. And so I think that's why Senator Myrie and a lot of his colleagues are really pushing for prison reform that helps folks get out, because there's just no reason for aging, elderly, mostly sick, chronically ill folks to be stuck in our prison system. And then there's one other issue that I think, Tess, you wanted me to hit on, which is also that we are seeing more and more women be incarcerated than before. So we're seeing a lot of men, many fewer men being incarcerated with that plummeting prison population, but we're still seeing an uptick in the incarceration of women, particularly women of color. So that is another problem that we're seeing be highlighted by these shifting numbers. And at some point, Tess, I think when we talk about maybe bail reform or something else, I can get into the changing numbers for our state's jail population, which are similar.
Thank you. That's really helpful to kind of give us some background. Now, I think it's fair to say that right now we're in a moment where we're seeing some pushback on criminal justice reform. And I think a lot of the people on this panel, and everyone should correct me if I'm wrong, think that a lot of this pushback is based on misinformation, that there's a mischaracterization of what these reforms mean and what their impact is going to be. And sort of a perfect example of that is the recent bail reform. And so, Senator Myrie, I was hoping that you might talk to us a little bit about whether you think there's misinformation about bail reform, and if there is, how do we combat that problem? So how do we combat the problem of misinformation making people reluctant to support criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so I was intimately involved in the passage of bail reform when we, in 2019, assumed the state Senate for the first time for the better part of a century, Democrats. This was something that was top of mind for us. And I had the honor of being in the working group that Leader Stuart Cousins convened to hash this out and see where we could go, not just on bail, but on speedy trial and discovery as well. So sort of a pre-trial package. And I remember us coming to a conclusion on the direction we were going to go in. It passes, and this is in 2019. You started seeing news stories in the fall of 2019 attributing crimes to bail reform that was not enacted yet. And that sounds ridiculous, but it is 100% true. And you can go back and you can do Google searches and you can see. And so here we are, starting to see in November and December of 2019, folks attribute random crimes to the yet to be enacted bail reform. It goes into effect in January, and then a month later, we're in a once in a century pandemic. And so we had a sort of confluence of events that were really terrible for optics and for having a reality-based discussion. The truth is, and I have folks on this panel that are much smarter than I am on the numbers, but the truth is that bail reform has been phenomenally successful. If the point of our public safety apparatus is to prevent those who are justice involved from re-offending and from causing even more harm and trauma in the community, by that metric, this has been an incredibly successful effort. 98% of individuals who have gone through this process do not violently re-offend. That if we were talking about any other policy area and there was a 98% success rate, this would not be a conversation. We would not be talking about this we'd be saying, great job, everybody. How can we replicate that in other areas? But because our discussions around criminal legal reform are inextricably tied to the structural racism in this country, to sensationalism, to some of the things that we don't feel comfortable talking about publicly, because they are so tied, we cannot have a conversation that is based in reality. And that is a tough, that's a tough pill to swallow for those of us who believe deeply in this type of reform. I've walked the streets in my district, and I have constituents that look like me, who have been in the community for a very long time, who say things like, when are we going to get rid of bail reform? When are we going to bring back stop and frisk? When are we going to get tougher on crime? And these are Black and brown folks who were watching the 6 o'clock news, who were seeing the pages in the New York Post and the New York Daily News. And it is shifting what I believe to be genuine anxiety and fear, solely based on misinformation and propaganda. And so we have tried, I have tried my best to have as many of those one-on-one conversations, but to also push back publicly in the media about what we're talking about. I think we have to come from a place of empathy. We cannot say you are being outlandish. People are afraid. That is a fact. That people are afraid. People are anxious. But then we have to take it to the next step and say we can't make policy decisions based on fear and anxiety. We have to base it on justice and the facts.
Thank you. And it's similar to bail reform. I think, DA Bragg, you've had some pushbacks on some of your policies, particularly around choosing not to incarcerate certain people who traditionally might have been incarcerated, at least in Manhattan, if not necessarily in other places. And there's this fear that by not incarcerating people, we're actually going to increase violence in Manhattan. Do you think that's a fair assessment, and why or why not?
So I still want to start where Senator Myrie left off, because I think these human interactions are so important, and also giving voice to people who are living with public safety concerns. So for me, away from the papers and all the reporting, probably the most kind of poignant moment I've had was with a youth group a few weeks ago, 16-year-olds, all girls, talking about how their safety riding the train and how they feel. And I think that's gotta be the starting place, people's feelings and their perceptions and how they're navigating and talking about them and talking about conditions in the community. And then also talking about the data, as Senator Myrie said, and meeting those and marrying those. And so particularly for the people who are living in it, not at all being dismissive, but instead saying, hey, and then talking about what the concern is. So, if the concern is, guns, for example, talking about how, bail reform didn't touch, guns in statute, and, talking about that, obviously, in this example, in an age-appropriate way. So I think talking about the data is very important. You asked me specifically about Manhattan. I think it's also important when you talk about, safety and fairness, to talk about pre-pandemic. In Manhattan, as is the case in other places, we had both declining incarceration and declining crime, right? So we've seen errors like that before. They are historically consistent in the recent data history of our city. And so, yes, so some of the things we're doing in Manhattan, some of them have been happening in Manhattan for some time, and we're enhancing them and building upon them, which I think is an important distinction that's been lost. And others, as your question maybe not said explicitly, but hinted at, is that been happening in other parts of this city and other boroughs that are not less safe than Manhattan. And so pointing to those other data points, in this case, literally other boroughs within the same city that charging similar conduct differently, is, to me, that's what we did. We looked at what was working in other boroughs and looked at the data and said, let's replicate that. Let's obviously do that in a way that looks at individual facts and individual cases. So I think having these kind of textured conversations, which is, great about the city bar, right? We have a lot of time set aside. We can have these conversations. A lot of these conversations, unfortunately, happen in sound bites, or you have a hour conversation, and what gets reported is like the 30-second, moment of what they were waiting for you to say without the full context. So these kind of conversations are important, but I think also taking them, and in particular, talking to people who are living, as many of my neighbors are. I've had a lot of the same conversations as the senator, who are living and feeling public safety concerns. So addressing them, and then affirmatively, particularly from my seat, talking about what we're doing. We are doing gun cases every day of the week. They are important in my office, right? We did a human trafficking case last week that was very significant. We did a ghost gun case. So talking about what we are responding to and what we are doing affirmatively, particularly from my seat, is also very important.
And just to sort of follow up on that a little bit further, do you think it's the case that necessarily sort of alternatives to incarceration, how do you think alternatives to incarceration sort of programming interact with public safety? I think there's sometimes an assumption that you have to incarcerate someone if public safety is your goal. And it's sort of like justice versus public safety. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about whether that's always the case.
Yeah, and again, with the professor here, I'm always going to defer to him when we talk about studies. But obviously, there's data out of Boston, and there's data out of Baltimore, showing the efficacy of such diversion programs. The example I like to give, because I think it's just so real to many New Yorkers, is we often read the paper and see the example of someone who does or is alleged to have done a horrific act, and then say, oh wait, this is their 8th interaction with the criminal justice system. And I think we rightfully ask, like, what happened on the first 7 interactions? And so what we're trying to do in Manhattan is scale up. And again, it's not writing on a blank slate. Programs have been here in Manhattan for some time, scaled up under my predecessor. And certainly when you look to Brooklyn, for example, are happening at a greater scale. But to try to address those 7 first times, so that we don't get to the 8th time where we're reading the paper saying what happened. So we're not churning people in and out of Rikers without looking at the underlying cause. I mean, it is just a true fact that for mental health treatment, the first diagnosis might happen on Rikers, right? So what we're trying to do in the office that we think is going to be particularly impactful is to cut down on the time in the life cycle of a case, and so that make the diversion decision sooner, and so that someone's not waiting in Rikers for, in some instances, a year to 14 months before being connected to services. And we think that's going to be very impactful. Studies have shown that's going to increase the efficacy of the intervention, and then ultimately, which is I think the core of your question, make us safer. And I think the data shows that. And those of us who've interacted with people with serious mental illness or substance use disorder, before they had intervention and after they had intervention, can kind of draw on personal experience to complement the data.
That's really helpful. And I'm sorry to stick with you, DA Bragg, but the one other criticism that comes up a lot, I promise I'll go after you after this question. One other criticism that comes up a lot with criminal justice reform is the idea that it somehow silences victims, that victims' voices are not heard in criminal justice reform. And how do you make sure when you're doing these reform efforts that, I'm sorry if people can hear my children. How do you make sure when you're doing criminal justice reform that you are listening to victims? Like what do you have mechanisms? What do you do to try and make sure those voices are heard?
I mean, I think it's key. And again, from my seat, this is what we're doing every day. So earlier today, I was with a coalition of service providers in Harlem, virtually I was, but they service Harlem and Washington Heights and domestic violence survivors. And we were talking about both of these issues side by side. It was actually very similar to your question about reform and safety and going hand in hand. And the reality that they know, these service providers, is it's the same population, right? It's the same population experiencing both fairness issues and public safety issues. And so, trying to compartmentalize them just doesn't comport with reality. So, it is, integral to what we do at the DA's office. We have, a phenomenal witness aid service unit. I spent a lot of time with them over the past 6 weeks. That just are phenomenal. We have got a Harlem office and a Washington Heights office, which I think is really important, kind of meeting folks where they are. So we are very kind of conscious about talking about the harm that is done and those that are harmed, and servicing them and supporting them, but also contextualizing that, as was sort of kind of discussed earlier today in this meeting, and alluded to, understanding the context that we're experiencing both. I mean, those who are in this space and spend time in courtrooms know that Monday's witness is Wednesday's victim, and might be Friday's person charged with a crime. That is the reality. And so trying to address things holistically and rather than compartmentalize is just, I think, just integral to our work. But I appreciate the question, because it's something that I think we do need to keep, those who are harmed directly and those who are harmed indirectly kind of front and center in the conversation. One, because I think that's where particularly my role as DA, my focus needs to be. And two, I also think it's important to the conversation. It's important to the conversation to be focusing on the people harmed and not putting people in these kind of just boxes. You are this or you are that, because that's not the reality.
I think that's really important, and it's a great sort of dynamic that you've described there, that the people are not always in one category, and that this is a complicated situation that we're dealing with. And sort of to go back to the sort of original thought, talking about misinformation and criticisms of the criminal justice system, I think this is commonly called sort of the Willie Horton effect, right? That it's really easy to see when criminal justice reform has failed, if you will. The one person who's out on bail who commits the horrific act is very obvious, while the people who go home and keep their jobs and stay in their community and therefore don't commit future crimes are not so obvious. And I'm wondering, Professor Pfaff, if you have thoughts about how to try and explain to people this dynamic that we see so often. You're muted.
Sorry. You think after all these years of Zoom school, I'd be better at this. So just for those who, I'm sure most people here are familiar with Willie Horton, but for those who aren't, the story behind it is in the 70s into the 80s, almost 40 some states and the feds had these things called furlough programs. If you're in prison, you're allowed to go home some weekends and maintain ties because you are going to leave prison. You need to be able to have a job and things. So let's keep you tethered to the community. And in Massachusetts had a program, it was working fine. We know at the time of the Willie Horton event that 99% of all people came back without incident, because there's an article in the Christian Science Monitor in 1988 with the 99% number. But Horton doesn't. He absconds, he goes on to Maryland, he breaks into a home, he viciously stabs the man who lives there, he rapes the woman who lives there, he gets arrested, he's serving a life without parole sentence now in Jessup. And he becomes this sort of huge racist ad in the 88 presidential campaign that gets unleashed against Michael Dukakis, who's the then governor of Massachusetts. Remarkably, you can find the ad on YouTube. And one of the most depressing things about the Horton ad is if you watch it now, your immediate thought is, that's it, right? Like by the standards of the racist ads you've seen lately, the Horton ad actually isn't that bad, which is a whole separate terrifying thing to contemplate, which it's another 2-hour panel to go through that. But as a fallout from this ad, which probably didn't really do much, but the sensationalism of it did, every state banished this program, right? And solving this is really hard because it's not just because we can see the person who commits a crime and those who don't, right? If the person spends more time in prison or jail than they need, it's impossible to see that they wouldn't have offended, right? I can do that with stats tables. Look at table 16B, like risk pool A shouldn't be in jail, right? But table 16B never can go up against politically like the grieving family pointing to the one bad case. Even worse is the police and the DAs can point to every bail reform failure. They perp walk them, put their names out there, but the public defenders and defense attorneys can't, right? They're ethically bound to not put their client on blast, right? If the client agrees to be like the poster child for bail reform, they can do it, but who wants to be the guy who went to Rikers, got out and got his life back on track? You just want to be the guy who gets his life back on track, right? So the politics here are profoundly asymmetric. Solving this is tricky. There's a weird anecdote that gives me optimism though. So there's another Willie Horton case years ago, same kind of story, 2 people released from prison. both of them commit murder. One of them murders a police officer, right? So in many ways, this is an even worse offense. The police unions, the sheriffs, law enforcement are all demanding you shut down this furlough program. And the governor gets up and says, no, right? This furlough program is essential to rehabilitation. It's essential to reentry. I'll fire a person here and there for this mess up, but I'm keeping the program. And that governor was noted California progressive, Ronald Reagan, right? And so we're at a point now where our progressive views are more conservative than Ronald Reagan's views were in the 60s. In some ways, that puts us in a very dark place. In some ways, it suggests that there's reason to be hopeful, right? That this is not some durable pessimism, right? That we've always been like. To me, the best solution, though, is to make sure those who are sort of most impacted by the good and the bad have the loudest voice. Here's an interesting fact about our progressive DAs. Almost every single progressive DA has been elected by a county that doesn't have suburbs. Philadelphia County, just Philadelphia. Brooklyn, no suburbs. Manhattan, no suburbs. St. Louis City, Baltimore City, San Francisco, the city. Boston has suburbs, but it's like 1/10 the population. Portland has suburbs, but it's about 1/10 the population. It's because in those counties where you don't have conservative suburbanites unaffected by crime, but passionate about the issue and punitive and don't feel the costs, tough on crime wins. But Larry Krasner did the best in the districts this past year in his re-election campaign. He did the best in the districts with the highest rates of shooting, right? The tough on crime guy won the safe districts. Krasner won the districts that had a crime problem. It's because these are the people who actually see the Horton effect, right? They realize it's their cousin who doesn't need to be in jail because their cousin isn't an abstract young black man who's scary to the suburbs. He's Bob. They know Bob. And it's a waste for Bob to be in prison or jail. While Joe is terrifying, perhaps Joe is the one that understands to be locked up, and they understand the cost and the benefits because they are living the cost and both costs and benefits. And so I think the more we can sort of cut out the unaffected, right, and consolidate decision-making in those who feel the cost of over-enforcement and the cost of under-enforcement, the better off we are. And I don't know how you make the suburbs stop voting in Houston and Dallas, but like that should be like the long run goal, I think.
So, with that, I think it might be worth talking about a few of the proposals lingering that are up to change the laws in New York in hopes of reducing incarceration. And one of those is treatment, not jail. And Senator Myrie, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about treatment, not jail, and what your thoughts are on that specific proposal.
Yeah, so that is sponsored by my colleague from Queens, Senator Jessica Ramos. And the bill essentially, I think, enhances the state's ability to not have our jails be the mode of treatment for mental health problems and other health problems. I think this has been said many times on this panel already, but sort of anecdotally, people say that the largest mental hospital we have in New York is Rikers Island, and that should not be the case. That's not how people should be treated. So it offers more options for individuals to be diverted from the justice system to get the help that they need. It makes some adjustments to the requirements for that. My understanding is right now you have to plead guilty in order to be afforded some of these opportunities to get help. It removes that requirement and other impediments that just makes it easier for folks to get the help that they need. This is every single tragedy that we see sensationalized is a tragedy nonetheless. And overwhelmingly, it is a mental health tragedy. And I think that if we shift the paradigm to say that these are mental health issues that deserve the full force of our government, the full force of our resources, and that is a public safety measure, not just locking this person up, I think we're going to be in a better place. So I'm a proud co-sponsor of the bill, and my hope is that we can get that across the finish line this session.
Tia Bragg, I'm curious as to your thoughts about this bill, if you're familiar with it, or about the sort of notion more generally. I think there are programs that provide mental health treatment, but they're largely based on prosecutorial consent right now. Prosecutors have to go say this is okay, and the treatment not jail bill would move this discretion to judges so that prosecutors aren't the gatekeeper. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those kind of laws that shift who has the power in deciding who gets treatment.
Yeah, so that is a significant difference in our statute between mental health and drug diversion. That mental health, the access is upon consent and approval of the prosecutor. In sort of the sort of broad goals of the bill, I certainly support it. I mean, I think one thing that we're looking at in Manhattan is expanding the mental health court, obviously in connection with the Office of Court Administration and stakeholders like those who are providing the support. But that's sort of a goal of mine, to sort of look to expand the capacity. I think our mental health court, the cap is 50 in terms of the number of people we can have, getting diverted on mental health. So I think we have a capacity issue. That's also that number. And we think about 50 versus sort of, the traffic in Manhattan and the courts. I think there's broad consensus that number could be far higher, but that's the contract, and that's also sort of the infrastructure that's around it. So I think we should be looking to expand, I guess statewide. I haven't looked beyond Manhattan, but certainly a bill that promotes it elsewhere. My focus has really been on trying to put infrastructure in place and coordinate with the courts and our service providers to hopefully scale up to get beyond our contractual cap of 50. And in terms of sort of who should be the gatekeeper, one thing that has shifted over time sort of before me, and that we're looking to continue that shift, is that our guidance, what we're doing is rooted in clinicians and being led by the clinicians. And so I think that's consistent with if not all the way to what this law would mandate. But we want to be evaluating the case and looking at the lawyering, but want to be deferring because our assistant district attorneys are not medical health professionals, obviously.
Another sort of arena of proposed reforms, and there's several different areas this is, but people who are serving long sentences, giving them the chance to have their sentence reevaluated or to go up for parole earlier than they might otherwise. The New York State Bar Association has sponsored one such bill, the Second Chance Act, which came out of the Mass Incarceration Task Force. Julian, can you talk a little bit about some of the bills that have been proposed and what impact they might potentially have on the sort of prison population that you were talking about before?
Sure. If we're speaking specifically at looking at resentencing, like the Second Chance Act that was supported by the Mass Incarceration Task Force and the City Bar Association, but just any legislation that gave folks a second look could have a significant effect on our state's prison population. Of the 30,000 people incarcerated in New York prisons right now, about 22% are sentenced to 10 years or more. And Professor Pfaff will co-sign this. I think, social scientists agree that lengthy prison sentences do little, if anything, to keep communities safe, and actually could have a criminogenic effect because of the instability and the ties that are cut, which I think Professor Pfaff talks about when talking about furlough, and DA Bragg also hit on. And so we know that if we had a petitioner-initiated second look law in New York that would allow for resentencing after 10 or 15 years of incarceration. That would make more than 4,000 New Yorkers currently incarcerated in New York prisons eligible to petition for a second resentencing. And so that would be about 1,000 of those people would be released if we had a 25% rate of release based on resentencing. And so if folks aren't convinced by that 1,000 folks, it also has cost savings for the state as well. If 1,000 people were released based on some new legislation that gave them a second look after 10 or 15 years, that would save the state $69.3 million. And so there are other numbers. Tess, I don't know if you want me to talk about if we did elder parole, if we passed elder parole or fair and timely parole, there would also be significant impacts on the prison population, but also huge cost savings that could be reinvested in the kinds of supports that DA Bragg was talking about and Senator Myrie, that folks need to successfully flourish in their communities after contact with the criminal legal system, whether it's pretrial or post-release. So that number gets as high as $680 million if we were to pass fair and timely. So it's a ton of money that could be used not incarcerating people, but actually helping our communities flourish and helping folks really address the root causes of their offenses and their contact with the criminal legal system.
Could you just you mentioned elder parole, and as someone who was recently in a state prison and saw, very elderly people talking to their families, one in a wheelchair, and just was struck by, why are we doing this? Like, why are we holding these older people in prison at this stage? This man in a wheelchair is clearly not a public safety risk to public. Could you talk about what elder parole is just briefly? And I think that would be helpful for everyone.
Sure. The elder parole bill would allow people in prison who are over the age of 55 and have already served 15 years in prison an opportunity to appear before the parole board for reconsideration of release on parole or not. Currently, just so that you know, the current release rate for folks who go before the parole board is 40%. So that is just something to think about. But there are about 1,100 people over the age of 55 who have served 15 years in prison and are not yet eligible for release, but could be under passage of elder parole. And yes, why are we incarcerating folks who really cannot reoffend and have spent a lot of time in prison? That's a question that Senator Myrie is asking.
So I think it would be, if we don't talk about the sentencing laws, we're kind of missing a big piece of what's going on with mass incarceration. And so there's sort of recently been a push to end mandatory minimums entirely in New York. And in particular, there's some sort of subsections that, like mandatory persistent, which is New York's version of the 3 strikes law, or laws that require people who commit 2 felonies within a certain time frame to be incarcerated with that second felony, and the possibility of removing those. And the Bar Association has advocated specifically for the repeal of predicate felon and violent predicate felon laws, as well as these 3 strike laws. And I was wondering, Senator Myrie, can you tell us anything about whether this is something the legislature sort of has an appetite for, is thinking about at this moment?
Yeah, so I sponsor what is colloquially known as EMMA, but the Ending Mandatory Minimums Act. And we actually just had a legislative briefing on this. And just for those of you who don't spend your days wondering what the legislature does and the mechanics, we do these legislative briefings where we invite members of the legislature and or their staffs to come in and learn about a bill, make presentations and take questions, much like what we're doing tonight. And we did one on ending mandatory minimums last week. I was not expecting a lot of my colleagues to show up, particularly because of the atmosphere that we find ourselves in now on the public discourse. And we had almost 90 people in attendance on that. And that to me suggests, Tess, that there is appetite for this, but it is, I think we'd be fooling ourselves to say that it's not a difficult road in the climate that we find ourselves in right now. I've been a part of larger conversations on this bill where we've had former judges come in and say to the public that there were decisions that they made on sentencing that they did not want to make, that they knew was wrong, but they had to, given the mandatory nature of our laws. And to me, there's no greater tragedy than that, to have an individual before you who you know that incarceration is not the solution to their problem. It is not going to help them rehabilitate. It won't bring true justice to those who were affected by the offense, and it's going to hurt the community, but you have to make that decision anyways. And this is really about trying to restore balance and to have the court make a determination as to whether a long sentence is the appropriate remedy for this individual's offense. And I just want to make one rhetorical point here in that we have a lot of conversations about introducing dangerousness in the pretrial context, in saying the judges need more discretion to make determinations about whether a person should be denied their liberty before they have been convicted of a crime. But when we talk about judicial discretion post-conviction, after the facts have been adjudicated, after there has been a determination of what the offense is, people say, whoa, 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 whoa. No, we need to have mandatory minimums. We cannot give the judge discretion to decide how long this person should be incarcerated. And I think that points to what we're talking about this entire evening, and that sometimes this comes from a disingenuous place. It comes from misinformation. People aren't really concerned about what is best for public safety, but I think are reflexing back to our punitive reflexes in the system. And so I hope that the legislative briefing that we held is a good indication about the appetite in the legislature. And I think as we continue to have the public discourse around it, and we continue to have acknowledgement of all of the harms that mandatory minimums have done, I think we'll be on good footing.
That's wonderful to hear. I think that's very exciting to people that there's that much interest in it. Professor Pfaff, we've kind of talked about some of the different reforms that all of us on this end of things have been thinking about. From your perspective, like what are the big reforms that you would see as necessary to sort of end mass incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple big tricky issues to think about here, right? I mean, one thing to realize, it's true, New York has had this fairly remarkable sustained decarceration. It's the longest running one, sort of the longest running decarceration in the country. We started in 1999 until California's changed. We had the biggest drop of any state in the country. Even California's is weird. So we still might kind of be number one because they moved a lot of people into jail. So it's not clear how much California really did. But what's really, I think, important to realize is that as we go from 70,000 to, I haven't looked at the post-pandemic numbers, but around 2019, it's around 40,000 or so. The number of people in for violent crimes barely budged. Went from like 39,000 to like 35,000, right? New York's decarceration has been driven almost entirely by releasing people convicted of non-violent crimes from prison, which great, but we haven't shown any real desire to change how we handle violence. And if we don't change violence, we're going to run out of non-violent cases to remove from our prisons, and we're going to be stuck at around 35,000, which is still well above where we were for all crimes in the 1970s, right? And just to put it in, it's a national story, right? Until in 2019, obviously not true now, but in 2019, there were just as many murders as there were in 1970, even though the population was a lot bigger. But the number of people in prison for murder in 2019 equaled the entire prison population for all crimes in 1970, right? 1/4 of our prison population is murder and rape alone, right? Just murder and rape puts us in the top 25 countries for incarceration, top 15. It's a seriously difficult issue. And many of the people who are in their 60s have been there for 30 years. Almost all of them are in prison for murder, some for armed robbery, some for attempted murder, some for rape. Very, very few people, especially now, are in there for drugs or property. There are some, you'll see them in the data. And to be clear, from a public safety point of view, should this 65-year-old person in a wheelchair there for murder need to be there? Absolutely not. From a retributivist point of view, is that too long? Compared to Europe, absolutely, right? Their maxes for murder, from a moral point of view, cap out at oftentimes 15 or 20 for the worst of homicides, right? But that is the challenge we face. We have to talk about violence if we really want to decarcerate. I think also on the older front, it's true that a lot of these old people are people sentenced when young, but if you look at those, the data is weirdly broken up. But look at those who are 65 or older, fully half of them were admitted in their 50s. Right? We have this general theory, and it's roughly true, right? That people tend to engage in criminal behavior in their teens and early 20s, and they all sort of generally age out. And while that's generally true, there is a cohort of older people who aren't, right? And it's not entirely clear why, right? Is it drug exposure when they're younger has sort of derailed their lives and they can't quite get them on track? Is it earlier prison exposure that's keeping them sort of, again, derailed and unable to get their lives back on track? But there is a significant chunk of our older prisoners are relatively recent admissions. And so, a policy based on you must have spent at least 15 or 20 years before you get the second look is going to exclude, well, probably over half of all people who are 16 and older in our prisons. And many of them aren't, again, it goes back to what DA Bragg said. Many of them are probably there for their 6th, 7th, 8th time. They're cycling in and out for their entire lives. Do we really think this 9th time in their 60s, that's going to solve it? No, no. And so it's not necessarily sound policy, but I think we've oftentimes framed things in ways that allow us to attack the low-hanging fruit at the expense of the higher fruit, right? I get in 2010, you don't pass this Punish Murder Less Act, right? You start with drugs. There's a consensus there. That's where you build from. But we built this consensus in a way that has made violent crimes even less touchable, right? That we're going to we frame it as, well, these people, the drug cases, they deserve to get out, which is a framing that suggests that everyone there for everything else deserves these draconian sentences we've imposed. And we're finding it very hard to shift our rhetoric in a way that expands our view of what's possible to include these violent cases. But there's only 14% of the US prison population is in prison for drugs, 55% in for violence, 25% for murder and rape. And until we have that reform conversation, which is going to be tough and hard, and it will end political careers as we work our way through it, right? It's going to require a tremendous amount of bravery to do it. But if we don't, we're going to be stuck as the world's jailer for decades to come if we don't figure out how to talk about these questions.
So I think sort of one of the interesting things in what you said, right, and obviously there's this sort of 25% of murder and rape, and that's sort of true violence. And then there's a section of people where we call it a violent crime, and there's an array of what is and is not violent. And there's also the question of whether DA Bragg sort of hinted at this, right, that, or didn't said it explicitly, we encounter someone at that first arrest prior to the murder, and what are we failing to do that prevents that later crime? And I think one of the ways that this comes up in a very sensationalized way is when we talk about young people who are caught possessing firearms, that there's this notion that's really being pushed right now that the only thing we can do to keep New Yorkers safe is to take young men, and mainly young men of color, who are found possessing a loaded gun off the streets. That's the answer, is to put them in jail for a few years, since that's the range you're talking about, and somehow that's going to solve the safety problem. And there's been a lot of focus on that in the rhetoric. And in some places, I think they are looking at alternatives to incarceration for even that population that has this sort of fear mongering associated with it. And Julian, I was wondering if you could discuss the sort of those programs, whether they exist in New York and what we know about them.
Sure. I think I just want to preface it by speaking about a Center for Court Innovation study that actually interviewed a bunch of young males from New York City. Most of them were Black and Latinx. And so they spoke to 330 people between the ages of 16 and 24 to learn why they were carrying guns. Obviously in New York City, because this is New York City. And the vast majority had already been victims or knew a victim of gun violence, to DA Bragg's point. Today's shooter is yesterday's shooting victim or adjacent to that quite often. Though we like to think of there's this wholly innocent person that gets shot at, and then there are these terrible people that shoot people, right? And that's just not where we are. And so 88% of the participants had a family member or friend who had been shot at, 81% had been shot or shot at, and they did not trust the police to keep them safe. So they carried their own guns. They're not out there to menace people. They're there to protect themselves. And so I just want to set that baseline understanding of who we're talking about. They're not just children, but they're children who don't feel safe and are trying to protect themselves, because we as a community, as leaders, are not making them feel like we're protecting them. So that's number one. And so one example of to get to your actual question, Tess, one of the programs that have been established exists in Brooklyn. So DA Gonzalez has the YCP program. Don't ask me what it stands for, I've forgotten. But between 2006 and 2016, the youth that were placed into the YCP program, with 16-year-olds to 22-year-olds, or I'm sorry, they're not 16 to 22, but it's a diversion program for young folks who are charged with gun crimes. 22%, they had a 22% lower rearrest rate within 3 years than others in their 16 to 24-year-old age group. So these are kids who are caught with guns, most likely for the reasons that the Center for Court Innovation learned about, who were not merely incarcerated for 3 years, going back to your mandatory minimum question, Tess, and instead were put into a program that gave them social workers, services, connecting them to housing, connecting them to jobs, connecting them to education. And compared to the kids who were caught with guns and sent to prison, they had a 22% lower rearrest rate overall, not just for guns, but just overall. And it shows that, there are successful ways to address the needs of folks who are walking around with guns, and not merely rely on incarceration and its ineffectiveness, as Professor Pfaff spoke about. There's also a similar program in Monroe County. I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but Monroe County, upstate, well, for me, everywhere north of, Westchester's upstate, but upstate also has a similar program with similarly successful results. And so we're seeing that even after someone commits the crime of gun possession or gets caught with a gun during the course of another crime, they could be successfully diverted. And then there are lots of other programs that address preventing the crime and violence before someone even has police contact. And there are success stories here in Brooklyn and Crown Heights. There are success stories in Richmond, California, that shows that these interventions, these community-based intervention programs, do a better job of preventing gun violence than traditional policing and prosecution.
So I just want to highlight and underline one stat that you said, which is that young people who did this program had 22% less likelihood of being rearrested, which actually means that if we incarcerate them, we are less safe because they are more likely to commit crimes in the future. So I really think it's really important to understand, and I know you all have been saying this, but to focus in on the fact that sometimes when people are pushing back against criminal justice reforms, they're actually potentially making us less safe in doing so. And I do want to talk a little bit, we're having this conversation about changing mandatory minimums, creating diversion programs as alternatives. And I wanted to talk about some of the restrictions that we have right now on what pleas are allowed. And DA Bragg, you have some policies in your office that there's a presumption of non-incarceration for certain people, except as required by law. There's a certain sense that at least some of the time the law requires incarceration. And can you talk about that, about how those bounds work and how they affect your policy making?
Sure. Can I kind of start with where Julian left off with?
Absolutely.
What I've been spending time, because I think I know this youth population fairly well in Central Harlem, who are scared and then are taking matters into their own hands. I also know that we've got shootings spiking up in the same neighborhoods. Upper Manhattan a little less so than some of the other boroughs in terms of the below 18 population. Our percentage, I think, is around 7% of our shootings are in that age, which is lower than other parts of the city and the country. But I've been spending time. I was with the Teens Against Guns group the other night, talking about just the importance of not doing that. And I actually think that in terms of supportive structures around, I talked to, and I teach a Sunday school class. I talked to them about being safe and how to navigate going to trusted adults. Because we also know the impulsivity of youth. And so, the jump from gun possession to using that gun is also real. And so I view that as part of the role of DA, is to be engaging with these groups on the prevention side. And so I just wanted to give voice to that, because we talk about impulsivity when we're talking about raising age. Other things also, a 15-year-old walking around with a gun, is a scary thing. I've had a number of shootings in my neighborhood by folks. Again, the numbers are not specific, as high as they are elsewhere as they are in Manhattan for the under 18, but it's still an issue. And so I think part of that scaffolding, sort of all the youth groups, the youth enrichment, I would include our cure violence folks, the great work that they're doing, just talking about the risk of carrying a gun, in addition to whatever the criminal liability may be, just the inherent danger. I think I've now lost Tess's question. I think it was in terms of sort of presumptions, and this is one on which we're specifically talking about and mindful of the district attorney in Brooklyn, also mindful of trying to have scale and guidelines, but also trying to really have individualized justice and making clear that every case stands on its own four legs, so to speak. So this is something that, as we're sort of in the beginning now, we're working out specifically on this exact issue, where there's clearly sort of, I think we've kind of talked a little bit around it in other areas, but where I would say, you've got the youth population and thinking about them specifically, and then you also have the cases where there's someone who's older and has had no engagement, and you're sort of asking sort of, why? In my own life, I've talked about this, right? My brother-in-law, who was quite young, who had a constructive gun possession charge, and my father had one. So I think those presumptions, and this is something that sort of early in the administration thinking about, we got to be careful not to just talk about the exceptions to the rule and not the rule. This goes back to kind of Senator Myrie's, point, and something frankly I've kind of learned, early in this first 6 weeks. Those exceptions I just noticed. If you can talk to them and have a full conversation with folks, I can say most of my neighbors understand that when I talk to them. But quite frankly, what they're thinking about first is the person walking around the streets who is with a gun, who is shooting it, using it to rob a store, doing something like that. And so again, I can go more deeply into charging, but I think in terms of how we frame the questions to make it clear, particularly for my office, what we are addressing and giving primacy to. And this goes back to, I guess, the professor's point, but it's slightly, and I'm curious if it may be slightly intentional with it, because one thing that we're focusing on is the drivers of violence, kind of as we sort of try to divert, looking at the drivers of violence, which doesn't take us into the population professor that you're talking about. And something I think about a lot is our clearance rates are quite low, right? So our shootings and what we're solving, and so I'm trying to put more resources into that, necessarily drive that number up if we are successful in making those cases. And I think making those cases is important. So there's a little bit of attention there. If we're doing our job better on some of those more serious cases, it may drive that number up. And I don't know how that goes into the calculus, but it was something I was thinking about as you were talking, because I do view it as a part of my job to say, hey, let's do fewer of these cases where I think we can divert, and that's going to make us safer. But also, it's obviously the NYPD is in the lead, but we're working together. And I view it as every case that we can't solve and figure out who pulled the trigger, to me, is problematic. But then that runs right into the data you were talking about. So I just kind of giving voice, I was thinking about that as you were talking.
Absolutely. And I just want to let attendees know the Q&A, you can type questions into the chat. DA Bragg actually has to leave at 7:30. So if you have questions specifically for him, I encourage you to put them in the chat and I'll try and get to them. And since I know you're leaving soon, and I did want to ask you, you sort of talked about the policies and exceptions to the rule and sort of people focusing on the exceptions, but how are you going to ensure that the exceptions don't sort of overwhelm the rule? I think you've only been there 6 weeks, but there's been a little bit of pushback from some of the public defenders organizations suggesting that they haven't seen as much of a change as they had hoped to see in your administration, and concerns that the exceptions are overwhelming the rule. What's your response to that kind of criticism? You're muted.
Once a day, always. Sorry about that. So my response is that, look, I appreciate the feedback. We are, as I've told the office, and I think also said publicly, I view this as part of kind of an iterative, dynamic process where we're, having an internal conversation and learning. Obviously, I've been in this space for 20 years, but haven't been in the office. So learning and really doing kind of dynamic supervision when we're talking about cases individually, with the sort of new leadership team and with the folks who are here and have been, in my view and opinion, very receptive to what we're talking about. In many instances, pointing out that some of this was being done before. So I think it's a process. Obviously, if you're representing someone and someone's right in front of you, and every case is important. So I don't mean to sort of say wait until tomorrow, but I do think in terms of coming up with the abstractions and sort of what the exceptions will be rooted in sort of the data and what we're seeing. I've looked at the data for the month of January. You talk about us vis-a-vis other boroughs, and we're sort of closer to in line on sort of key metrics in terms of bail and charging decisions, but not where I think we will ultimately be. So I guess the message is, it's been 6 weeks. We will continue to listen to stakeholders, and I think that the office will be a different place in 6 months and a different place in a year, and we're trying to sort of learn as we go. Sounds as if we're kind of making it up, but it's learn as we go from the cases that get presented, right? I think one thing that was a challenge from my initial articulation, which while the preamble talked about individualized justice and things of that nature, is that it was static and was sort of a document that wasn't breathing. And what we're doing every day in the office is, breathing life into it and responding to individual cases, and then from those decisions, abstracting out and very intensely communicating that into the office. And so it's sort of lived history.
And I'm seeing a sort of a question here about the availability of alternatives to incarceration. And correct me if I'm wrong, do you call it alternatives to incarceration, or you're using a different terminology?
Well, if we use the terminology of the courts, there is an ATI felony part, there's the mental health court, there's the veterans court, there's the drug court. So as I read, I can see the chat too. I think they're using the language of what court use. So
yeah, I think you can see the same question that I'm looking at that's addressed to you. And can you speak? It's sort of this question of is everyone eligible for diversion? Will everyone at least be considered this, even if they're in cases involving firearms? Is there still the possibility that in an appropriate case they'll get diversion? And how is that process working?
Right. So let me kind of take a step back and say what we're doing. So we have started a new division within the office called Pathways to Public Safety. The head of that is Shireen Crawford, who some of you may know, who was at Center for Court Innovation, and before that was a assistant district attorney in Manhattan, and before that was at Safe Horizon. So deep expertise in prosecution and in victims' rights and in diversion. And so, and this is something else that will be a process, right? We are setting up an entire division, and that division will interact with the trial division, which is doing the majority of the street crime cases. And the thought is to have someone from Pathways involved at the earliest stage. I mentioned this earlier, to sort of evaluate a case and see if it's appropriate for diversion, and then to get the intervention much sooner than it's happened in the past. We're in the process of standing this up, and there are a lot of moving parts, but that is, we've started. That's the objective, and I think when we get to scale, we'll really have an impact. Of course, it's not just us, right? So we have to coordinate with service providers to make sure that sort of we're matching scale to scale there, and also the courts. And so we will be looking at every case as it comes through to see if it's, if we view it's appropriate. And then obviously we talked earlier about sort of who the gatekeeper is. It's different as a matter of law for each of these courts. But then ultimately have to sort of engage, unless it's a pre-charge diversion, which we will be doing. But for the ones that engage with the courts in this question, obviously, having clinicians involved in driving the decisions, but ultimately, hopefully crafting a plan that's approved by the court. So, we're in the process of it, and when we are fully scaled up, the thought is that we're going to have folks from that division with expertise in diversion, assessing, every case that comes through ECAB, at the earliest stage.
So as you were talking about sort of scaling up, one of the things that came to my mind was the budgetary question, right? I know that the Manhattan ATI part was previously funded by forfeiture monies that aren't available to other counties, right? It's not free, the reforms that we're talking about. I think Julian alluded to the cost savings, but it's sort of the shifting of funding that would be required. And I wonder, I think, whoever feels like they could address this, maybe Senator Myrie could talk about the budget or Julian could talk about what would be necessary. But if someone could talk about monetarily what needs to happen, or DA Bragg, if you're comfortable, what's required to make this success from that standpoint.
I mean, I'm happy to start. The senator probably knows the senator knows the appropriation process far better than I do. But I can say in the first 6 weeks, as I look at our priorities, certainly budgeting is an issue. The city, I guess, preliminary budget, I think, came out today. I was meeting with our budget team last night. And I know we could have a philosophical conversation about where these monies should go. We have a number of programs that are up and running, our diversion programs that have contract dollars on them. And they've got to be paid for, and many of them I want to scale up. And I know that runs into headwinds of sort of, scaling up the system that folks want to scale down. But, I'm very interested in increasing those diversions. So some of the things I've just said cost more money. We want to do it in a way that is looking at the efficacy of programs. Making sure that we're not scaling up something that just says diversion on it, but it's not actually working. A number of things that we want to do cost money, and so balancing that against, other investments, which you asked the professor, sort of, how do we, what are the number one kind of reforms? And what comes to mind to me is like, if we had more affordable housing, we would have, fewer criminal justice issues. And specifically, I was on a panel yesterday where we just spent an hour talking about mental health. There's so many things we could be doing to invest there that would save us a number of issues. But from kind of where I sit in the sort of the kind of four corners of this office, scaling up the diversion programs that are offered is really key. We'll be having that conversation in Albany and in City Hall to try to get support for them.
Senator Myrie, maybe you could talk about that. I mean, we've talked about the costs of prisons, but that cost is sort of baked into the budget and the difficulties that come from trying to shift those budgets to pay for new things.
Yeah, and I know I think I saw Julian unmute too, so I don't want to monopolize the whole answer here. But when we were talking about the closure, I think it was Professor Pfaff discussing the reliance of the surrounding communities in prisons on that prison. It's not just a political one, it is an economic one. And in every time that we have closed, at least in my time in the legislature, that we have closed a prison, we have heard loudly from the representatives of that particular neighborhood to say, you can't do this to us. What about the jobs? And what about everything that is connected to that prison? And I think that's a dynamic that we have to contend with. But to I think the larger point on investing in diversion and what it means for the budget, I think it goes without saying that we should be putting more money into that. But the disinvestment that has happened over decades, the tens of thousands of hospital beds that are no longer here, the amount of money that we have not invested in our public schools, it wasn't up until 2020 that we had the proper allocation of money given to our public schools as determined by the Court of Appeals in 2009. We just had an administration that refused to fund it at the formula set out by the court. And we just passed what is called foundation aid on our public school system last year. So, we have, you talk about COVID-19 really laying bare all of the problems that we had, food insecurity, the lack of healthcare provision, the drivers of comorbidities in Black and brown neighborhoods. Of course, we're going to see upticks in crime. And of course, we're going to see more unrest as the social fabric has been ripped apart. And so I think as much as we focus on the programmatic money that is needed, and I am a huge proponent of that, I would like to see massive investments on the front end, or the so-called upriver things like schooling and food insecurity and affordable housing. Now
maybe I'll sneak, it's my turn to not unmute. Everyone does it once, right? I'll sneak in one more question before you leave us, and thank you for your time. But there's a question about appeal waivers and whether your office is considering changing policies about appeal waivers.
We are. We're examining. We have incoming, my former colleague from the New York State Attorney General's office, Stephen Wu, who's going to be joining us in about a month to head our appeals division. And I've been getting a lot of discussion from stakeholders about appeals waivers. So it's definitely something we're going to be assessing. But he's, I think, probably the last member of the incoming executive team to join. And so waiting for him to get here to kind of help us, kind of address that issue and other issues, some of which we addressed tonight in terms of kind of sentencing clawbacks and things like that as well.
Well, thank you. I know you have to hop off. We really appreciate you being there. Any last words you want to say before you leave?
No, just thanks for providing a forum where we can, talk in long form and also, exchange these ideas. So I appreciate it, and I apologize that I've got to leave a little early. So thank you so much. Have a great night.
We've got a few more questions in the chat that I think we can go through with the remainder of our time. Senator Myrie, one person asked, she or he said, I've heard about your sponsorship of a bill allowing prosecutors to re-sentence incarcerated people. How will this bill shape incarceration in New York? And our DAs, both conservative and progressive in the state, supportive of the bill?
Yeah, so I introduced this before the second look bill that I think Julian was talking about was introduced last year. And this is a bill that, as the person who asked the question said, allows prosecutors to make motions to the judge in the interest of justice, and it lines out what those factors could be, including the time spent incarcerated, the public safety threat that this individual may or may not pose, their disciplinary record while incarcerated, a number of factors for the court to consider to allow for this person to be resentenced and, with the goal of them being released. My understanding is that in my conversations with the DA's offices, we worked closely with the Brooklyn DA's office on this, that there are hundreds of individuals right now that could benefit from such a motion. To the question of whether or not this is supported by other prosecutors, that is unclear to me. I know that there is support from at least one prosecutor's office, and that's the Brooklyn DA's office. But I can't speak to sort of the larger context. I will say, and I'm not just saying that because DA Bragg is no longer on the call, but I have to say that legislatively, anytime that we are giving prosecutors more discretion, it makes it more likely that they are supportive. But that's a double-edged sword, because as the wielders of power in the criminal legal system, that discretion has also been abused and misused in the past. And so there's a balance that has to be struck. And I'm a supporter of the second look bill as well, or a second chance rather, and look back. And so that's the story on that bill.
Wonderful. And so I think this is sort of an interesting question, I think, for anyone in the group who would like to chime in on this. One of the questioners says that New York has been successful in lowering our incarceration rate, and relative to the rest of the United States have a much lower incarceration rate. That we're, according to this questionnaire, 43 in the US in terms of people incarcerated in terms of rate per 100,000. And, so how low are we aiming to go? Like, what point have we ended the era of mass incarceration? And how low do we go, particularly considering that Professor Pfaff has told us that we're certainly going to have to release violent, what we think of as violent offenders in order to significantly decrease the population further. So is there anyone who wants to kind of chime in on that?
I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, I'd start by saying I think we want to be careful not to call them violent offenders, right? Like it's a really hard term to purge. In my book, I say never use a term in every draft that crept in somewhere with as much as I tried to get rid of it, right? Because I think the problem with violent offenders is it makes the person always violent, right? This is who they are. And as a general matter, with also empirical caveats I won't spend an hour getting into, right? It's not a state, it's a phase. People age into and then age out of violence, right? I'm just less violent now than I was in my 20s. My testosterone levels are lower. I'm older. I'm tired. Things hurt and ache. Like I'm just not going to get in that same fight I would have before. I'm going to lose it faster because I'm slower, right? And so I think when you think about it that way, that pushes back against that sort of throw away the key instinct, right? At least from a public safety point of view, that the person locked up at 18 is not going to be the same person when they're 40, right? California saw this. They allowed resentencing a lot of their long-term people in prison, and they found that the reoffending rate the rearrest rate was like 1/10 the state average, right? Because they were just older and they were wiser and they thought more carefully. And the fact is, I think there are lots of things we can do that do reduce violence that aren't prison, right? You know, we have to focus on violence. There might be cases where we need prison perhaps, but, you know, things like, you know, there's programs that like, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy shows significant returns at least amongst young men versus prison, right? So it keeps them out of prison. It makes the risk of violence lower, and it makes their lives better, right? We know that even dumb things like, not dumb things, like surprising things like putting better street lights in, right, has a huge impact on violence, right? And the DOTs are already in place to scale that up tomorrow, right? And so I think the idea that somehow violence is something we can't get past, right? Like I think it might mean the fact that it keeps a lot of people, honestly, it keeps me perhaps from being like a full abolitionist, right? But I think there's a lot we can do that can both reduce violence and make people better off. You know, Medicaid expansion had a huge reduction on violent crime through drug treatment, non-punitive, non-drug court drug treatment, right? The cost savings justified it just on the crime reduction, often is for like drug treatment, on top of the fact that you're not addicted to drugs anymore, and your life is in a better place, and you're a more thriving life, right? And so I don't think we should think like what's our target, right? The target is as low as we can go. It might not be zero, but there are lots of ways we can address even serious violence in ways that create accountability without being brutalizing, and make us safer. And we just need to be willing to embrace those opportunities.
You sort of raised an interesting point of accountability, right? I think there's sometimes people feel like in this rhetoric that when we say someone isn't going to be incarcerated, there's a suggestion that they're getting away with the crime, there's no accountability, and which leads to the second point, right? That the conviction itself, right? We've talked a lot about incarceration, and we sort of touched on this with the notion of diversion, where often you don't have a conviction afterwards. But there's also sort of a huge impact of the conviction itself on someone's life. And I know Senator Myrie, I believe you're involved with the Clean Slate Act, and I'll pivot back to the accountability point, but first, if you could talk to about the Clean Slate Act and what that would do.
Yeah, so I'm not merely involved. It is my baby. It's a bill that I sponsor and have been working with a really incredible coalition of advocates and practitioners on. And what the Clean Slate Act would do is automatically seal a certain category of convictions. Misdemeanors after 3 years of not having any offenses, and 7 years for felonies, with some minor exceptions. And you talk about public safety tools that are not just punitive. This is a public safety bill. What we have right now is a system that is based on perpetual punishment. You are convicted, you are then released, and then you can't get housing, you can't get a job, you can't get financial aid for school. You were denied all of the opportunities that you need to reintegrate successfully, and to be someone that avoids some of the pitfalls that we're discussing tonight. We have seen automatic sealing happen in other jurisdictions, and we've seen how much of an economic boost this has been, not just to the individual, but to entire communities. We have people that are walking our streets right now, living with their conviction, being prevented from taking advantage of many opportunities, and they can't provide for their families. Those families are impacted by that. And this is not someone that, the sort of what Professor Pfaff was talking about, someone who was perpetually offending, or someone who's in and out of incarceration. This is individuals that are remaining crime-free, and they just want an opportunity to be a part of the community the same way that you and I are. We're talking about 2.3 million New Yorkers, 1 in 7 New Yorkers. We all know people with a conviction record, whether or not they have revealed that to us or not. And so our Clean Slate Act, I'm very hopeful about where we are on it in the legislative process. The governor has put this in her executive budget. We are getting very close to the passage of that. And I hope that this becomes a part of the conversation. I know we haven't discussed this much, but for Mayor Adams's, for all of his efforts around gun violence and reducing crime, I mean, he has, and I agree with some and strongly disagree with others, he has been very supportive of the Clean Slate Act and has said so publicly and privately to us in our conference. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to be a tool that we utilize.
And just to sort of highlight what you said, and it sort of ties into what Professor Pfaff had said before about how mass incarceration and the criminal justice system has sort of shaped society in this much larger way. There was this study by the Brennan Center that really stood out to me that said that just the fact of a felony conviction alone without incarceration reduced someone's earnings 21.7%. and a misdemeanor 16%. And then if you add imprisonment, it's a reduction of 51%. So these are huge numbers, and then, you know, are aggravated by sort of racial discrimination and racial impact that already are leading to lesser earnings in communities of color. And then you add that the high rates of conviction and the unequal rates of conviction, and that's how it sort of economically decimates certain communities. And so I just want to throw that out there because that stat was really shocking to me, even as someone who's very involved in this work. And then I did want to kind of move back to this notion of accountability, and someone in the questions had asked about restorative justice specifically. And Julian, I was wondering if you could talk about sort of these alternative mechanisms for accountability that don't necessarily require incarceration.
Sure. Yeah, I think what both Professor Pfaff and Senator Myrie just did is reframe the question, in that it's not about like how much incarceration we need, right? No one's like, let's incarcerate 100 people and make sure there are 100 people in jail, right? That's not going to make public safety work, right? The question really is like, what do we need to be investing in as a society for the benefit of public safety and the benefit of communities, really? And so there is no magic number. No, there's no magic number. We can't point to Belgium, or certainly not China, or other countries, be like, that's the incarceration we want. It's perfect. No, it's not, right? Incarceration for incarceration's sake is not going to answer that question. And I think you guys really you did a good job of highlighting why. So the question really is, how do we hold people, like you're saying, Tess, accountable, and also address the harms that they caused, whether it's economic harm or physical harm or psycho-emotional harm, right? And also address the harm that contact with the system does to those people, right? There are harms that incarceration inflicts on the people who have created some kind of harm. And so it creates this cycle that we've all talked about. And so there are proven solutions. We talked about some earlier, where it comes to diversion programs that give people the kinds of social supports that they need to move forward. It could be, community violence intervention programs that prevent crime by going into the community and leveraging relationships to prevent retaliatory violence, or to give cognitive behavioral therapy and casework management and drug treatment and all the other things we know really lower and prevent crime on the front end. And then on the back end, there are things that are programs like restorative justice programs that really focus on accountability, so that the person who is harmed doesn't feel like we're investing in this person who has harmed me by giving them a job or giving them case management, and I'm left harmed, right? And no one is going to be made whole, right? No, there is no making whole, at least for the kinds of violent crime that we think about, right? The question is, how can we help repair some of that harm without creating further harm? And there are programs like restorative justice programs that really involve the person who is the recipient of the initial harm and the person who perpetrated the harm, to create accountability. And maybe it's not true reconnection between the two. That's a little Disney fairy tale of us, but does repair harm and prevent future harm, and hold that person accountable. And then there are other kinds of programs, because we also don't necessarily want to burden the victim. Like, you have to go in here and talk to this person. So there are other kinds of services that can be given to survivors of harm, where they feel repaired, right? There's some sense of repair and reparation for them, and help them move forward and flourish without having to be held back by that harm, without creating further harm. And so there's tons of programs that are abound in our communities that are extremely underfunded. And so we were taking, let's say, the $500,000 per person it takes to incarcerate a person at Rikers Island per year, and put that into some kind of survivor support programming, plus pretrial services, plus justice impacted housing. You could get so much money out of $500,000 for one case, right? So there are many ways to address the public safety problem without trying to hit some tipping point of the prison population making us safer.
So I'm gonna ask this one. I love this because it's a very nerdy stats question, and I want to ask it. And then I would love each panelist just kind of any last thoughts that they want to leave us with here. And it's a question for Professor Pfaff. So Senator Myrie cited the statistic for the bail law that 98% of people were not rearrested. And this person is pointing out that you might be comparing apples to oranges. That if you're comparing, you shouldn't be comparing the entire population that's released. You should be comparing who would have been released to who wasn't released. So how helpful is that 98% number in really understanding the impact of bail reform?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a completely fair question to ask. And fortunately, I was actually just looking at our bail numbers more closely today. One trick is look at the bail population, the released population, the sort of the pretrial release population overall. It's an empirical mess, because you'd think bail reform would lead to like a larger number of people out on pretrial release, but because COVID hit 2 months later and misdemeanor everything shut down, right? The number of people in jail on misdemeanors drops, and the number of people on pretrial release for misdemeanors drops, because they simply stopped making misdemeanor arrests, in part because people probably also stopped doing a lot of the stuff that we do for misdemeanors, because misdemeanors are sort of the dumb stuff you do on the street and no one's on the street, right? So trying to figure out exactly what it did when you got bail reform and COVID hitting the exact same time, very, very hard. But the one thing we do see is that a couple months into this, there is a decent increase in the number of people on pretrial release who have been charged with a violent offense, right? And what's interesting to note is that the percent of those who get rearrested before and after doesn't really change at all, right? And so the idea was the fact that the judges have been really, really good about selecting things. And then all of a sudden there's this huge chunk of 2,000 more people. So it goes from like 7,000 to 9,000. So it's what, a 7/7 increase? I'm not good at this kind of math anymore. It's like, I don't know, some percent, right? If that increase was sort of the people they always knew not to release, are not being compelled to release, then we should see some significant increase in the failure rate for that population as a whole. And it increases a tiny bit, but not so much that I think that, like the judges were right with this extra chunk they're now releasing to not release them when their hands are being forced, right? So at least within this one subset where we see an increase, there is some evidence that there's not much of a change, suggesting that there might be a little, the 1% might be overstating a little bit of success, but not by much, right? And so I think it's a completely fair question. You're right that we really do want to focus on like those who are being forced to release who wouldn't have been released before. It's hard to see them given the weirdness COVID did. The one little subset we had to look at least suggests that there's a little bit of that, but not a lot as a concern.
And one stat I want to throw in there that I found interesting is that actually, people held for gun possession alone, the percentage of people who are released pre-trial is actually lower now for gun possession than it was before the bail reform, which is just sort of an interesting, and I think probably speaks to press pressure to a certain extent. So with that said, it's a good time for us to wrap up. So, Senator Myrie, maybe you could kick us off again. Any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, no, I just express my gratitude once again for the invite and the opportunity to, as the DA mentioned, to sort of speak in long form. This is rare, particularly for me, having to try to communicate through the media on a number of very nuanced and difficult issues. Having conversations like this, it's very helpful. And the temptation, all of us are in this space consistently. The temptation is to be very insular in this conversation and to get very wonky and into legalese and all that good stuff. And I enjoy being in the weeds just as much as everybody else. But going out and talking to like everyday folks who are living this, the impacted individuals, that is the part that I have found most refreshing. I like to call this barbershop diplomacy. And so what folks are talking about when I'm getting my hair cut, that to me gives me sort of a real pulse on what's happening. And the conversations are nuanced there. They are expressing a lot of the things that we spoke about. They are saying that our young kids need assistance, but they don't want to go back to many of the lived experience that they had growing up in Brooklyn. And that is the line that we're trying to walk, certainly as policymakers, is to not be reactionary, but to try to do the best that we can based in data and based in the experiences of the folks that we represent. And so I'm just grateful to be able to have this type of conversation. And I would urge all of you to continue to talk to folks outside of your comfort zone, because I think that helps inform your advocacy, and it informs how we're going to move forward.
Thank you, Senator. We really appreciate you being here as well. It's been lovely to have this. The fact that there's some hope for criminal justice reform, I think, is going to keep a lot of us going in our work. So I'm very grateful to hear that. Julian, maybe you'd like to go next. Your thoughts?
Sure. I'm also just very grateful that we were able to have this event and have such esteemed co-panelists. So thank you all, and thank you for your insights and your commitment to this work. I think one thing that I want to make sure didn't get lost in, as the senator said, the weeds, though we did touch on it, is we are not dismissing how much hurt and harm people are experiencing right now. There's a nationwide uptick in gun violence and homicides. That correlation or causation, I don't know, but that definitely began at the onset of the pandemic and is continuing to affect us like the pandemic is in so many ways. And so it is important for us to just not lose sight of the fact that we all acknowledge the harm and that there needs to be a concerted effort to address where that's coming from and why. But as the senator said, it is very nuanced. And I think, as all of my co-panelists have pointed to, there's a difference between politics and policy. And the politics are saying one thing because it's an easy soundbite to say, well, it's criminal justice reform, or it's bail reform, or it's this judge, or, there's no one answer, but, politicians are politicians and need to be elected and reelected. And so there's politics and then there's policy. And that's where the nuance that the senator was talking about comes in. And that's where the data that Professor Pfaff really highlighted and made easy to digest in ways that I find difficult to do. So thank you for that. And so just being mindful of there's politics and there's policy, and good policy is going to help us reduce and hopefully at some point eliminate the harm that folks in our communities are feeling.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Pfaff, if you could give us your.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you to all the panelists. This was great. And I think my sort of final thought kind of actually builds kind of off where Julian left off, which is, as much as I am most comfortable with the data and most comfortable with the policy, the one thing that's really struck me lately is how much mass incarceration isn't really policy. It is something more political, right? That, not much policy changed between the 1970s and the 2000s. This wasn't something that was coerced into being by laws we can now change out and coerce it down. We chose to do this. And most of the reforms, most of the declines took place without any change either. Like New York State, there was no law change that caused New York State to decarcerate. The Rockefeller reforms didn't do much. It was a decision mostly by 5 DAs in New York City to just stop sending people to prison. They chose that, right? And so much of where we are isn't based on policy, but based on what we choose to think about, how restricted and narrow our vision can be, right? That we equate accountability with prison and are almost impossible to think of it differently, right? Forces in this idea that somehow if you don't send them to prison, they're not being held accountable, when we know there's so many other ways to be held accountable. There are people who say restorative justice is worse than prison, right? That it is hard to sit in a room and stare your victim in the eye and have them tell you what you did to them and it's easier to go sit in a prison for a year than to have to deal with that, right? It's real accountability, right? Even just we hear the police say all the time, like, no, well, the DA won't prosecute there, so why should we arrest? Because there's a recent survey where the majority of Black respondents said they'd rather be the victim of a robbery than searched by the police, right? Like an interaction with the cops itself is a form of punishment and accountability that we dismiss, right? And be clear, most people don't go to prison, right? Half of all crimes don't get reported. The police make arrests in under half of those, and the DA send less than a majority of those to prison, right? Prison isn't real accountability, it's the one we focus on. Or even just think about the costs we talk about and the costs that we don't, right? We talk about how many more crimes we have to have for bail reform. I've never, in almost any coverage, heard Khalif Browder's name come up, right? It's going to take 100 people in jail, in Rikers, to reduce one violent felony arrest. That's about what the data tells us. 100 potential Khalifs in exchange for one fewer arrest. Are you okay with that trade-off? I'm not. Other people might be, right? But the point is, like, he's not in this conversation. He should be. We talk about the victims' families. What about his family? They were victimized too, right? There was when the JFK Human Rights Fund had tried to do this big Rikers bailout, the New York Times covered about 50 total, maybe it's 2 articles, probably about 75 paragraphs across the 2, because I counted. They talked about the risk of crime. They talked to DAs, they talked to police, they talked to public defenders, and not once across either article about the idea and its outcome, they say, hey, mothers and children are gonna be home for Thanksgiving. They were invisible, right? On both sides of this. We chose repeatedly not to look at them, right? To not acknowledge that part of it. And the trade-offs are awful and they're tough. How do you balance a victim of a crime versus a victim of being in Rikers? It is not an easy question, but so much of this is not about policy. It's about what we choose to look at, what we look away from, what we want to deny. It's much more, and I hate saying this as a quantitative person, it's much more emotional and political. And we have to start teaching ourselves to look at the world differently, right? Because we can change a lot without a single policy change. We just think about it in a different way and look at those awful corners that we just don't want to look at. And so I encourage people to try that, right? A lot of this is very much like what we have chosen over time to focus on. And we haven't focused on before. Ronald Reagan saw beyond it in the 60s, and we can't see what Ronald Reagan saw. And that's on us, but it's a vision thing, I think, as much as it is a policy thing. The policy helps, these things all reinforce, but it starts with forcing ourselves to look at those things and those trade-offs that are hard and uncomfortable and unpleasant, but it's where the change really has to come from.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to our attendees. Really appreciate it. It was lovely having this conversation, and I hope everyone has a good evening and that we continue to see more reform moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Tess, for great moderating. And thank you to the panelists. This was just such a great, thoughtful discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Bye.